Ron, we have so much to talk about, including the musical and your books, but let's start with the musical. Describe how you met Lin-Manuel Miranda first, and did you have any sense in the early days that the project would become an international sensation?
Well, the story of how I met Lin, so this carries us back to the fall of 2008. I was out walking in my neighborhood of Brooklyn Heights one day. I ran into my old friend Gara, and I said, Gara, what's new? He said, what's new? His daughter had gone to Wesleyan with Lin. He said, what's new? My daughter and I know this hip-hop guy, Lin, who has read your Hamilton book and become obsessed with it, and he would love to meet you. Now, Lin was still starring on Broadway in his first show, which was called In the Heights. So he invited me to a Sunday matinee. Luckily, I liked him. Luckily, I liked the show. And then I said to him backstage, I said, so I gather my book made a big impression on you. He said, Ron, I was reading the book on vacation in Mexico, and as I was reading the book, hip-hop songs started rising off the page. And I said to him, really? You know, it was not a typical reaction to one of my books, you know, at all. And then he said to me, very earnestly, he said, you know, Hamilton's life is a classic hip-hop narrative. And I'm thinking to myself, pal, I have no idea what you're talking about here, you know? He asked me to be the historical consultant to this as yet non-existent show. So I laughed and I said, I mean, you want me to tell you when something is wrong? And he said with great fervor, he said, yes, I want the historians to take this seriously. Well, at that point, you know, I had to make a confession to him. I said, you know, Lin, you're talking to a world-class ignoramus about hip-hop. I know nothing about it. And he said, well, I'm going to educate you. And he pointed out that with hip-hop, you have rhymed endings, you have internal rhymes, you know, you have wordplay. And we signed on, and really, I didn't think that this was ever going to be a big cultural phenomenon. I think his invitation to join the development of the show brought out a certain Mickey Rooney side of my personality. You know, wouldn't this be fun to put on a show together? I was a lifelong theater goer. And so I said yes, but you know, Lin and I worked together on the show for 7 years, and every single person that I met during that 7-year period, whom I told about the show, either said outright or else they were thinking, this has to be the single silliest idea I have ever heard in my life, you know, a hip-hop musical about Alexander Hamilton. And it took me time to figure out what it was about the equation of Hamilton and hip-hop. And I think what it is that, number one, the hip-hop music has a kind of driving, propulsive quality, which actually matches Hamilton's personality. Hamilton is like a character that's shot out of a cannon, and the music has that kind of rhythmic excitement to it. The other thing is that since so much of Hamilton's life revolved around his use of words, hip-hop, the lyrics are so dense that the show is almost 3 hours long. It's really a 6-hour show. Actually, we calculated at one point that Hamilton has more lines than Hamlet, and Hamlet is the longest part in Shakespeare. So, the linguistic density of hip-hop perfectly suited this person who wrote his way out of poverty and obscurity in St. Croix.
Remarkable. And you were saying, you know, initially you didn't know whether or not it would work, but the early reaction suggested that you really did have something special.
We had certain opportunities to really test the material. One, there was an American songbook series at Lincoln Center. Lin was asked to lead it off. He came out on stage. He was there with 2 or 3 other singers. Now, this was not staged, it was not choreographed, there was no scenery, there was no costumes. And Lin just came out and he said, I'm working on this concept album about Alexander Hamilton. You could hear titters in the audience when he said that. So they sang maybe 9 or 10 songs from the show. The show is actually 46 songs altogether, and I was with Oscar Eustis, the head of the Public Theater, and we were sitting there, and at the end, it was mostly the audience, people in their 20s and 30s. At the end, they jumped to their feet, and they were cheering and screaming and applauding, and I turned to Oscar and said, oh my God, if they're having this reaction to just a piece of the show, and a piece that wasn't staged or costumed or anything. Imagine when they see the entire thing, they're going to go absolutely crazy, which is what happened. And then also, I remember another time when I had that same reaction. There was a summer theater festival at Vassar called the Powerhouse Theater Festival. It was a black box theater. They performed songs from the first half of the show, just actors standing in front of music stands. And when they finished, I looked across the audience, and every single person in the audience was crying. And I was sitting next to my friend, Margot Lyon, great independent theater producer, who was always very politically involved. And she said to me, Ron, this is real patriotism. This is not fake patriotism. But everyone in the theater was crying. So Lin has this kind of pipeline into people's hearts. He can connect with the audience emotionally. I was saying backstage, Jeffrey, I've not only seen the show here and in London and across the country, I saw it last year, the premiere in Abu Dhabi, and they were on their feet screaming. So this show, Beyond the Politics, it seems to deal in a universal set of emotions. And I've spent a lot of time, Jeffrey, actually thinking about why first the book and then the show were so popular. And I think that one of the reasons is that Hamilton's achievements were so extraordinary that you could admire him, but his flaws were so grave that you could identify with him at the same time. I think that people have liked the idea, because it always seemed like the founders were goody-goodies, but suddenly here was this founder who was so brilliant and productive, but he also was a bad boy at times. And so I think that it gave people kind of emotional entryway into the story. But also I think that I was very lucky, and then Lin, with the musical was lucky, that Hamilton's story is a perfectly structured tragedy. This isn't something that I imposed on his life. It's not something that Lin imposed on his life. But if you look at the story, Hamilton goes from strength to strength to strength, and then about 3/4 of the way through book, musical, and life, there suddenly is a dying fall. And as in a Greek tragedy, all the qualities that powered his rise suddenly then produce his downfall. And so if you were inventing the story, that's exactly where you would want to have the tragic fall, but it just was this beautifully structured life. I've often said to people, there'll probably never be a great biography of James Madison because it peaks too early, then it kind of rambles on through Secretary of State and two-term president, whereas with Hamilton, there was this extraordinary character, a dramatic character at the center of it, but in this perfectly structured life for storytelling.
That's so remarkable. The previous biographies of Hamilton had painted a caricature.
Yeah.
There was a book, Gertrude Atherton's Hamilton, A True Story of Romance. It was a fictionalized biography, 1902. Yeah. It's an international bestseller, the Hamilton musical of its day, and it leads Theodore Roosevelt to create a big Hamilton revival, but it paints him as this heroic, manly, sort of virtuous guy against the fey Jefferson. It doesn't show the nuance. How say more about how capturing him in all of his complexity made him a hero for a divided age?
Well, I should say, when I started the book in 1998, Alexander Hamilton was fading into obscurity. I mean, it seems strange now, but most people had never heard of him before. If they had heard of Hamilton, they knew one of two things: that he was on the $10 bill and that he had died in a duel. Maybe they knew that the person who shot him was Aaron Burr, but the knowledge of him was that limited. And I started reading about his life. Number one, it was clear that just from a personal point of view, that this was far and away the most dramatic life of any of the founders. A completely, self-invented figure. It's just the most astonishing story of this kid who was an autodidact, who comes out of nowhere. He comes to North America just with a handful of introductions. He's effectively orphaned, although in the play he's described as an orphan. He had a brother who was a carpenter in St. Thomas, and he had a kind of ne'er-do-well father who had drifted down to the Grenadines, an island called Bequia. But for all intents and purposes, he was an orphan. In fact, when he married Eliza, neither his brother nor his father came. So it was like this person was really all alone in the world, and just by dint of the most extraordinary intelligence, created this dazzling intellect, this massive intellect. But part of the fascination of the story, which counts for this tragic quality, is that this dazzling intellect is on top of a very kind of fragile and unstable ego, psyche, if I can put it that way. Hamilton was illegitimate under the terms of his mother's divorce from earlier man. She was not allowed legally to remarry, so he was illegitimate. It's hard for us today to imagine what illegitimacy meant in the 18th century. He was extremely, extremely sensitive on this subject. He once wrote, he said, "My birth has been the subject of the most humiliating, criticisms," and particularly like, John Adams called him the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler. This was not funny for Hamilton. And so what would happen, because beneath the tremendous intellect, there was this, very rather kind of brittle psyche because of his background. If he was attacked, he would always counter-attack and often react to it. I mean, I know, Lynn said to me the line that got him interested when he was reading the book was, I wrote that Hamilton, as a teenager, had written this hurricane letter in the local newspaper in St. Croix, and then the local merchants recognized his genius and paid to educate him in North America. And I wrote Hamilton didn't realize it, but he had just written his way out of obscurity. And he was someone at any moment in his career, he fell back on the most powerful weapon in his arsenal, which was really words. But what happened with the Reynolds scandal, the Jeffersonians thought that he was paying James Reynolds the money because they were engaging in illicit treasury speculation together, and it was really, as you well know, because of the adultery. Well, when those charges came out about his having paid this money to James Reynolds, Hamilton felt obliged, again, to resort to his facility with language. And the Reynolds pamphlet, you don't get a sense of this in the show, it was 95 pages long. And one of the ways that I kind of identified with or kind of understood Hamilton was as a writer, because people, his friends at the time when he published the 95-page Reynolds pamphlet all said to him, a delicately worded paragraph or two would have done the trick. So it's like, why did you go on? But I understood as a writer, I could feel it as I was reading the pamphlet. With rewriters, any piece of writing takes on a life of its own. And so you could see that he starts telling it almost as a picaresque novel. Samurai Reynolds comes to his home, here in Philly, and Eliza was off in Albany with her father and the kids, so he was alone. She came, knocked on the door. She claimed she'd been abandoned by her husband. Could he help her out financially? And he said that he would bring money to her room, which was just a few blocks away. And then he writes the Reynolds pamphlet, and when I arrived, she was standing at the top of the stairs, and when I climbed up the stairs, she let me know that more than pecuniary consolation would be acceptable. Now, this is really, it's quite hilarious. You could see he's sort of having fun on some level. He's having fun narrating this, and as a writer, he can't help himself in terms of narrating this in this very kind of humorous way. Of course, for Eliza, it was not funny, and there's that great scene in the show where she's burning the letters. But we owe to Hamilton's facility with language, we owe both the best and the worst of him. When he was writing the Federalist Papers, as you all know, there were 85 of them. He wrote 51 over a 6-month period. He was writing at least 2 or 3 a week. There was twice he wrote 5 in 1 week. 1 week he wrote 6 in 1 week. And he had a full-time legal practice. He was writing them such white heat that we have anecdotal evidence that the printer would be sitting in the outer office waiting for him to finish it off. And both he and Madison talked about beautifully organized and well-stocked minds. They were writing this under such time pressure, there wasn't time to go and do any research. They were completely writing this out of their head. In fact, I was very surprised to learn that even though Hamilton had originated the Federalist Papers, was supervising it, very often he didn't see Madison's essays until they were already in print. And yet we read this, and the Federalist Papers not only played a role in terms of the ratification of the Constitution, but I remember at the time that I wrote the book, the figure was that Federalist Papers had been cited by the Supreme Court more than any other document or set of documents. Already, this was around 2000, had been cited 300 times by the Supreme Court. And this was something that these three men, there was also John Jay did 5 of the essays. When you think about the time pressure they were doing and how extraordinary their achievement was and how kind of beautifully furnished their minds were, that they were able to literally whip these things off and that they have stood the test of time. It's
so great to see Hamilton as a writer on deadline. And
yeah, and what a deadline.
And what a deadline. And as you said, it was that one sentence in your book, Hamilton didn't realize it, but he'd just written his way out of poverty, that convinced Lin-Manuel Miranda to write the musical. The rap against Hamilton by his greatest antagonist, Jefferson, was that he was a closet monarchist, a crypto-Caesar conspiring to resurrect monarchy in America. It all came back to a dinner where Hamilton had blurted out, when Jefferson said the 3 greatest men in history were John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton, Hamilton blurted out, the greatest man that ever lived was Julius Caesar. And Jefferson records, this proves that Hamilton is a closet monarchist. You say that Hamilton was probably joking because he had worried about a Caesar at the head of Shays' Rebellion, and he feared Caesarism as much as Jefferson. And yet he did favor a president elected for life, and even his friend Gouverneur Morris wasn't sure whether he yearned to resurrect monarchy. So how devoted was he to
I noticed,
president?
in your book you have a couple of places where he cites Julius Caesar, where he's criticizing someone, as a Caesar or a proto-Caesar. Okay, what happens, so he goes to the Constitutional Convention. His role is extremely important there because the governor of New York, Clinton, believe it or not, he was quite the boss. In fact, it was sort of governors like Clinton that Hamilton and Madison had in mind in terms of strong central government that would correct some of the abuses of the state. And George Clinton sends 3 delegates to the Constitutional Convention. But Governor Clinton was so afraid of any kind of centralizing tendency that might limit his power that 2 of his appointees, Lansing and Yates, actually left the Constitution in the middle, never signed it. So Hamilton is the only New York delegate there. So he's kind of a very, very important figure, and he kind of signs it in his personal name. Okay, there is one, there is one moment during the Constitution where Hamilton gets up and talks for 6 hours. It's referred to in the show that someone says that he got up there and talk in the convention was listless. They don't really talk about what the content of the speech was. So Hamilton, as the show says, created his own form of government, and what it would be was essentially an elective monarchy, that the president would serve for life and senators would serve for life. There would be a house that would be elected by universal suffrage, at least as defined at the time. Now, a couple of points to make. Hamilton was never in favor of a hereditary aristocracy or hereditary monarchy or anything like that. He also always pointed out, in terms of this form of government that he presented at the Constitutional Convention, number one, it would be an elected president. It would not be a hereditary president. And number two, that it would be a president who would be serving on good behavior. So he could be impeached and recalled. So it was not just, do I think that was a great idea? No, to state the obvious. But I think that Hamilton's fear was that the great weakness of the new republic was going to be what he called a lack of energy in the executive branch. he was very afraid that when you've gone through many years of revolution as we had, the spirit of defiance of authority has become so strong, it's difficult to turn it off. And there was Shays' rebellion, there were different kind of popular outbreaks that seemed to him to confirm his theory. Now, he wanted a strong executive, and this was a real kind of ideological split with Jefferson. Hamilton claimed that the best safeguard of liberty would be a strong executive. Jefferson felt that the greatest threat to liberty would be a strong executive. Obviously, two very, very different views. But since I had a hunch you might ask me about it, I just wanted to read a couple of things that Hamilton wrote, because actually he was perhaps our greatest prophet of populist demagogues, if I may read a couple of things. In Federalist #1, he wrote, "Of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the greatest number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing as demagogues and ending as tyrants." Another time he warned of the advent of a man unprincipled in private life, desperate in his fortune, and someone who was unprincipled in private life, who would foment chaos and ride the storm and direct the whirlwind. Because Hamilton made that speech, Hamilton, I think, had more of a role in calling Constitutional Convention and getting the Constitution ratified, certainly in New York, and explicated through the Federalist Papers. He thought that the Constitution would not stand the test of time, that indeed that would be a fatal weakness, the lack of executive power. But throughout his life, he contended that he saw the Constitution that we had as sort of beautiful but idealistic and unrealistic. He thought that time would prove him correct about that, but he did not try to subvert the Constitution. He made an interesting statement 2 years before he died. He said, "Mine is an odd destiny. Perhaps no man in the United States has done more for the present Constitution than myself. And contrary to all my anticipations of its fate, as you know from the very beginning, I'm still laboring to prop the frail and worthless fabric. Yet I have the murmurs of its friends no less than the curses of its foes for my rewards. What can I do better than withdraw from the scene? Every day proves to me more and more that this American world was not made for me." So he was kind of very, very hurt by that idea that he had tried to subvert the Constitution. And it's interesting, when Jefferson is Secretary of State and Hamilton is Secretary of Treasury, at first Washington does not fathom the degree of personal and ideological hostility between the two men. But then when he does, Washington, being a great president, wanted actually to have the interplay of different ideas. He did not want to have a monolithic cabinet at all. And he wrote a letter to Jefferson, because Jefferson had kept saying that Hamilton was behind this monarchical plot in the United States. And Washington writes him a letter saying, as to the idea that, of a monarchical plot, he said, "I don't think that there are 10 men in America whose opinions are worthwhile who believe that to be true." Now, Washington was in the best position to know if there had been any plot, but I spent 5 or 6 years working on that book, and while Hamilton's views on the elective monarchy and everything we're talking about, he didn't hide that. He was open about it, but I could never find a single letter where he was conspiring with someone else, in a plot. In fact, I felt, because when I started doing the book, I read all these previous books, and Hamilton was often described as this kind of intriguing, designing character. The deeper I got into his life, he was almost excessively honest and open about his views. Every view he held, he would write at voluminous length. Hamilton was never content on any issue just to write one essay. He would write a series of 5 or 10 or 20. He was not the sort of personality who could engage in a plot. He was very much a kind of, look at me character.
He's invoked on behalf of so many constitutional positions today. The unitary executive theory is attributed to his Pacificus letters, and he was the champion of the liberal construction that John Marshall used to uphold the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States, and which broad supporters of national power have invoked ever since. We're here at the Constitution Center gazing at Independence Hall. What would you sum up as Hamilton's greatest constitutional contributions?
Well, let me just first mention what he created in his life, because again, when I started the book, I felt, kind of whatever his flaws, personally or politically, what this man managed to create was extraordinary. Even before he became Treasury Secretary, of course, he had written the appeal for the Constitutional Convention, had written Federalist Papers, and had to be ratified in New York. He spoke 26 times in 6 weeks. New York was one state where it looked like it would not be passed. Hamilton got it passed in New York, which was very quick. He then, even before he becomes Treasury Secretary, creates the Bank of New York, first private bank in New York City. He then becomes Treasury Secretary and restores American credit with his funded debt. He creates the first central bank, the Bank of the United States. He creates the first mint. He creates the first Coast Guard. He creates the first customs service, on and on and on and on. This man really forged the federal government. And so I think that he was somebody, there were kind of three sides to Hamilton's contribution. One was kind of on the level of politics and ideology. One was in terms of his concrete contributions. And then also very important, and one of the reasons that I think Washington appointed Hamilton as his Treasury Secretary was that everything was setting a precedent. Here they had this Constitution, which was beautiful, but it was very brief and very general in terms of what this would actually translate into. And so Washington, who was at great pains to make sure that everything that he did was consistent with the Constitution, knew that Hamilton is a lawyer, and Hamilton, who had attended the Constitutional Convention and was a great lawyer, that Hamilton would make sure that everything that was done during his two terms as president would fit into the constitutional framework. So I think that his contributions were really quite extraordinary. And when I started writing the book in 1998, I just felt he was so villainized and so, caricatured. And it just seemed like a shame that a man who had made such immense contributions to the creation of our government, should have become this forgotten figure. So it's kind of funny now because I see in surveys Americans are asked to name their favorite founder, and this founder whom no one knew anything about suddenly is everyone's favorite. And I'll just tell you one last story, Jeffrey, that after the show opened, the Obama administration, Jack Lew was the Treasury Secretary, and he announced one day that he was dropping Hamilton from the $10 bill. And he was going to replace Hamilton with Harriet Tubman. Okay, I love Harriet Tubman, but I wanted to keep Hamilton. After Jack Lew made that announcement, there was a hue and cry against it. And he came to the theater one night, and I saw him in the audience, and I said, would you like to come backstage and meet Lin-Manuel Miranda? So we went backstage, and he told us, he didn't say that he was going to revoke his opinion. He just said, I think you're going to be pleased when you hear the final. But he admitted to us, he said the one thing that he had not reckoned on was the power of the musical. Actually kept Hamilton on the $10 bill, and we had it straight from the mouth of the Treasury Secretary.
Well, from saving Hamilton on the $10 bill to resurrecting his reputation throughout American history, you've shown in an electrifying way the extraordinary power of history to change American culture. One last question about the show. After I'm about to award you the Liberty Medal, which I'm so looking forward to doing, and then we're going to hear a performance of Satisfaction by Angelica. I gather she's one of your favorite characters. Tell us why you like the song.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In the show, Eliza meets Hamilton. She has this beautiful song, Helpless. And then you have Angelica sings this song, Satisfied. And basically, both songs are about their feelings about Hamilton. And Eliza, being younger, is looking at Hamilton through the eyes of innocence, and that Angelica is looking at Hamilton through the eyes of experience. And incidentally, one bit of dramatic license. In the show, when Hamilton meets the Schuyler sisters, both Schuyler sisters are single. But in fact, in reality, Angelica was married, and her husband, John Barker Church, was a member of Parliament in England. So, but Lynn said, and I understood dramatically why he did this, that having Hamilton meet both of the sisters together certainly injects a lot of drama in terms of which sister he would choose. But it's actually, I think, not only the great moment in the show, but maybe in musical theater, because what Lynn does, for those of you who remember the show, Angelica brings Hamilton over to meet Eliza. And he says, if it took a war for me to meet you, then it was worth it. Then you see the same scene. It's kind of redone. It's rewound. And he again goes over a second time. You have the same thing. But in the meantime, Angelica has given us this really much more realistic and even cynical interpretation of Hamilton as someone who would never be satisfied, and that much as Eliza loved Hamilton, that this was not going to be an easy marriage for him. And I asked Lynn, because I so loved that sequence and the repeating the scene. I said, where did you get that idea? Because they do the scene, and then you hear the chorus saying, rewind. Well, Lynn had a hip-hop improv group called Freestyle Love Supreme. And what they would do, they would ask the audience to throw out different words. And from the words that the audience threw out, the 5 hip-hop people would create a story. Amazing, but they would do it. And then he said what they would do when they finished creating a story from the words thrown out from the audience, one of the 5 would say, rewind, and they would do the same story but with a different ending. And that's where he got the idea. Just extraordinarily ingenious that he would have thought of doing it. But I love the song, and Lynn always used to say that the smartest person in the show was Angelica. Hamilton was pretty smart too. But there's no question that Angelica was quite extraordinary. There are certain things in the show that are so perfect that you think they must be invented, but they're not. And I remember when I was going through Eliza's papers at Columbia, I saw this little handwritten note in a very fine penmanship, and I pulled it out, and it was the note that Angelica had written to Eliza after the disclosure of the Reynolds affair, after the Reynolds pamphlet, when Eliza would, of course, have been completely shattered. And she writes to Eliza, in marrying our Hamilton, you married an Icarus, and he has flown too close to the sun. Now, that's in that beautiful song that Eliza sings when she's burning the letters. And she says, you know what Angelica said, and talks about Hamilton being this Icarus who flew too close to the sun. I'm sure 99% of the people, 99.9% of the people who see the show think that that must be an invented line, but that was actually something that Angelica did write to Eliza. And I can remember feeling a chill going down my spine when I came upon that letter. But it was such a sophisticated observation, as well as an accurate observation about Hamilton, that he climbed and climbed and climbed, and then he flew too close to the sun, and his wings melted. Yeah.
Ron Chernow, you show us that history is storytelling, and that the role of the historian can be dramatic, exciting, and even heroic. I can't tell you how much you are one of my heroes among historians. I was inspired to write about Hamilton, reading your description of his financial plan and seeing the clarity with which you took the technical complications and made them dramatic. inspired me to want to try to achieve a fraction of that much clarity. And in the process, your historical writing, not only Hamilton, but Washington, Grant, and more, has transformed a nation's understanding of history and inspired new generations of history lovers. And that's what's so beautiful about that gorgeous performance we just heard, and all of those kids going to Edgeham, and all of them just that curiosity sparked and having their passion for learning about history ignited by the marvelous storytelling that you have shared with us. Please join me in thanking Ron Chernow.